Hello, everyone. Feel weird in the middle of the room, but Krista Gardner, nice to meet you. Those of you who I've not met before, I am a partner in our York office. I am kind of unique. I split my time about 50-50 between government and nonprofits. That's all I've ever done my whole career. And in addition to audits and 990s, I also do a lot of outsourced CFO work for both governments and nonprofits. So that's kind of extra fun work for me where I get to really dig in, roll up my sleeves, and be a part of the team. Not that an auditor is not part of your team, but I get to just dig in a little bit more. So what I'm going to do today is talk a little bit about 990s. The best way to do that is to actually look at the 990s. So that's why I'm sitting here. We're going to have that up on the screen. Before I jump into 990s, I do just want to touch on state filings, what the differences are between what you have to file with the state and the IRS. Hopefully that's a refresher for most of you, but for those of you, it might be a newer topic. So I just want to make sure to kind of clarify that. So starting off, as a nonprofit, we are required to not only report with the IRS via our 990, but we are also required to report with the different states that we solicit contributions in. That's the key there, is soliciting contributions. So a lot of what I'm going to spend my time on here is talking about Pennsylvania's requirements. But we just heard from someone who's in Maryland. Each state has their own requirements on what nonprofits need to file with them annually. What's interesting about IRS versus the states is, in this case, the IRS isn't really the bad guy. It's the states, because the states are who make us pay an annual fee. And the states are those who are the ones that require us to have an annual audit, review, or a comp, where the IRS just requires a 990. So I know we often think of the IRS as the bad guy, but in our world, in nonprofits, it's more of the states that have more requirements for us annually. So one thing to think about is what states you are soliciting contributions in. This is going to help you identify where you should be filing. One of the things that I always like to point out is, what does it mean to solicit a contribution? So say you have someone, say you're located in Pennsylvania and you have a family member in California who donates to your charity in Pennsylvania. First time donates, what have you. Not a big deal. But then we add that person in California's name to our mailing list. We start sending them emails or newsletters or annual reports or any other kind of correspondence where part of that correspondence is soliciting contributions. We are now soliciting to someone in California. A lot of people don't think about that. The beauty of it is there is usually a threshold. So just because you get one donation or 2 donations or even 10 donations in a state does not necessarily mean you have to file in the state, but you are required as that organization to be tracking that and really understanding where you're soliciting donations from and where your donations are coming from. So in Pennsylvania, that threshold is $25,000. The minute an organization hits $25,000 of contribution, you've got 30 days to file with Pennsylvania. I cannot tell you how many times that deadline gets missed, is unknown, is passed. People just aren't aware of it. But that truly is the requirement, is that once an organization hits $25,000, you are required to start filing annually with the state of Pennsylvania. And that first required filing is within 30 days. There is always forgiveness that we can ask, and that gets asked quite often for newer organizations, but just something to be thinking about. And then most of the time, once we start filing with Pennsylvania or another state, we are going to have to file with them annually. Now, obviously, if it was a one-time thing or your organization is no longer soliciting contributions, there are some exceptions to that. But essentially, once we start filing in a state, we will annually be filing. So I talked about how there's some extra things that comes along with filing with our states. So we're going to get to the 990s. With the state of Pennsylvania and other states, there's an additional form that gets filed. This all kind of depends on the size of your organization and what 990 you file. So you're going to have to file a form. We call it a BCO 10 or a BCO 23. We like, numbers in the accounting world and in filing world. But essentially, it's a very, very mini version of the 990. And what happens is when you file this annual form with the state, your 990 also goes along with it. So it's really a supplemental report to the 990 that the state is requiring. And then what the state also requires is essentially what's up here on the screen is depending on what your contribution level is, you might have to submit internally prepared financials. So that means you run them out of QuickBooks, or we even have people who are still doing kind of manual statements in Excel, compiled financial statements, reviewed financial statements, or full audited financial statements. So depending on where your contributions fall in those categories, that's going to tell you what kind of financial statements are going to be required with the state. So now annually, you have to file their form, their BCO form. You have to send along your 990. You have to send along a set of financial statements. And then the fourth thing that you have to send along is a payment. So again, based on your contribution level, where those gross contributions come in, that's going to essentially say how much you have to pay annually to be a soliciting nonprofit in the state of Pennsylvania, and then fill in every other of the states. Because I have one client that files in all 50 states, and essentially each of those states have a different level of what they have to pay and what they have to file. So most of the time we're working with organizations that are only soliciting in one or maybe two states, but there are those out there that are soliciting in more than one or many. And so therefore knowing those requirements are important. So I'm going to pause there because I just plan to spend a couple of minutes on the state filings, but I'll ask if there's any questions before I jump into the 990. Okay, so a couple of things with the 990. There are various versions of the 990. What I have in front of us is the regular full 990. If this is all based on the number of the number of revenues or assets that your organization needs. There are two lower levels depending on your organization. There's a 990EZ. It's a shorter form. And then there is a 990N. We call this the 990 postcard. There's really not a lot of information that goes on the 990N. Essentially, all nonprofits are required to file a 990 annually with the IRS. So that's going to be a 990N, EZ, or 990. That can change from year to year. One thing we do recommend is if one year you do a 990, the next year you do a 990 EZ, if you think you're going to go back to a 990, it might just make sense to continue to do the full 990 because a lot of the information carries forward anyways. So just something to think about, but that can change depending on your activity for each year. There is also a 990PF that's going to be for private foundations. Not going to talk about that today, but that is a little bit different of a form that needs to be filed if you are working with a private foundation. So I'm going to be focusing on the full 990 here and just trying to highlight some areas to pay attention to. We could spend hours going through the 990. Although it is a tax return, we know there's really no tax related to it except for one caveat there, which I'll get to a little bit later in regards to 990Ts. But essentially, the 990 is really something that your organization should be using as a tool. A lot of times we're just filing it because it needs to be filed and we say, yep, looks good. But really, there are some things to be paying attention to really understand what this form is saying, because this is a public document. On GuideStar and in other places, but on GuideStar, essentially anyone can go out there and pull up your 990. Now, granted, unless you're going out there actively and updating it, it is going to be 2 to 3 years behind typically. But a lot of times, someone, if they're seriously considering donating to your organization, they might go out to GuideStar, look at your 990 and say, how are they spending the money? What are they spending what are their programs doing? What accomplishments do they have, etc. So I'm just going to point out a couple of areas to really pay attention to, because I do know that this form gets to be thick and it's a lot to pay attention to. Your core form, which I have up in front of us here, is 12 pages. These 12 pages, depending on what information we put in here, how we answer questions, that then adds on additional schedules. And those schedules can be 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 pages in addition to these 12 pages. And that's where sometimes a 990 is 50 plus pages, and it is a lot of information to go through. The one thing that I always recommend is you want to definitely have management, your board, your finance committees, your audit committees be taking a look at your 990. And it's really good to essentially take 1 year if you haven't done this recently and just take the time and go question by question and make sure everything makes sense. If we are assisting you in preparing your 990, we're trying to do that as much as possible, but this really is your document. And this is your opportunity to kind of brag about your organization and make sure that the picture that's being painted is really what you want people to see. So I say to always take a year, go question by question, spend the time. And then what's nice is you can identify on maybe that copy the items that really shouldn't change from year to year. You can kind of highlight them, mark them up, and then each year okay, as long as these things still match, I'm just going to spend the time on the areas where uh, you know, information is going to change, or if I have a new program or something like that. So that's what I really recommend. Starting on page 1 here, this is really the summary of your organization. The top half is about your organization, what type of organization are, how to contact you, etc. The one thing I do want to point out, because this does get a little bit confusing for some people, is the date. So the 22 date is always the beginning of your year. So if you are a calendar year end, your year operates January 1 through December 31, well then this year matches everything that you do. But if you are a June 30 year end, so say June 30, 23 coming up as your year end, you will be using the 22,990 to file for your June 30, 23 year end because your year begins in 22. So that is something that does get a little confusing. I'll often have clients say, hey, can you send me my 2021 990? And then I send them the 2021 990, but they really need the 2020 990 or what have you. So that is something to understand how the dating works on the 990s. Under the summary part, there is an opportunity for you to give a brief description of your organization. On the next page, there's a even bigger spot. And then on Schedule O, which I'll refer to Schedule O quite often, is your opportunity to give even more information because there is limited space throughout the 990. So on this first summary page, you can give a little brief description of your organization. And then you're going to give some information on volunteers, voting members, your revenues in this second box down here. This is going to be, and these numbers are going to pull from schedules that are back behind in our later pages, in our core pages of 1 through 12. But as you can see here in your revenues and your expenses, it's actually going to show prior year and current year. So it gives the reader a snapshot of what changed from last year to this year. And then at the very bottom, we've got revenues and we've got expenses. At the very bottom then is our total assets, liabilities, and then net assets. And that's going to show beginning of year versus end of year. So again, this is a quick snapshot for someone who's pulling up your 990, taking a quick look and saying, wow, what does this organization do? What do they have going on? What kind of activity? What are the dollars that are passing through, which is often the question that's asked. Once we get past the summary page, we get to page 2. Page 2 is really your opportunity to talk about what you do and why it's important. So essentially, this is going to be all about the organization's mission at the top, as we can see there. But again, if you need more room, you can always follow up on Schedule O. And then essentially, once we get down to 4, this is going to provide you an opportunity to take your top 3 programs, revenue streams, etc., and talk about what it is that you do, what your accomplishments are, how many people you serve, what results you have. And this then allows you to show, here are the expenses related to that program, here are the revenues related to that program, those in these buckets here. And then also, if you grant money to other organizations or individuals, that information is going to go in here. One thing to remember is in pages 1 through 12, the core schedules, depending on how you answer these questions, you then will have additional schedules that you'll need to fill out because more information will be required. This often I feel like the bare minimum is put in this section, but this truly is your time to shine and to really focus on the programs you want readers to know about. There's room for 3. Down here at the bottom, you can then add in all of your other program revenues and expenses. And then again, there's that Schedule O. That gives us the opportunity to then give more information. If you've got more than 3 major programs, you can give that information on Schedule O. Again, as much as you want. Schedule O can be as many pages as we need it to be. It could have accomplishments, what the programs are about, etc. And then total program expenses, which we're going to kind of circle back to in a few pages here when we talk about our breakout of different expense categories. This is going to be our total program service expenses. So total expenses that are directly related to your mission. Now, starting with part 4 is a lot of questions. So part 4, and I'm obviously don't have the time today to go through all of these questions, but these are the ones where some of them are very, very easy. Like, did you spend any time working with a lobbyist? But some of them can be a little bit more confusing or gray. A lot of times you will see where it says see instructions. There is a whole instruction booklet for the 990 that you can pull up. Also, whoever prepares your 990, whether it's SEK, a volunteer, or another firm or individual, you can reach out to them for clarification just to make sure that how you're answering that question is correct. So a lot of this is going to essentially tell you what schedules you need to fill out in addition to pages 1 through 12. That's going to continue on to page 4. So page 3 and 4, we've now just been answering lots of questions. And then that takes us down to part 5. Part 5 is then more questions, essentially about other filing. So this is going to be compliance with how many 1099s you file, if you had to file any W-2Gs related to gambling income, if you had to give anyone related, if you had any certain events where there was gambling money that was received, you would have to give that information here. And then this also goes into your W-3, so how many employees you had, etc. On this page is where I will also point out that other Form 990 that I said I would talk about, and that's the 990T. So just a brief highlight of what the 990T is if your organization receives any unrelatable income, meaning it's income not related to your mission, it can be taxable. And that's where a 990T needs to be filed annually to essentially show the revenues related to that activity, the expenses related to that activity, and then if there is any essentially income from that activity, you may have to pay a tax because it's not related to your mission. The reasoning here is you're a nonprofit. We have a mission. We've been approved as a nonprofit based on that mission. If we are conducting activities outside of that mission, we essentially might have to pay taxes like any other business. There's also some caveats in there that if you would be earning way too much income from unrelated activities that could, tower over all of your other nonprofit activities, you could be considered no longer a nonprofit organization. This doesn't happen very often, but essentially something to just keep an eye out for if you do start to have any activities or revenue generating income that is not related to your mission. Again, more questions here that's going to talk about sponsoring organizations. There's information here to look at as far as if you had ticketed events where someone paid more than $75. Was any part of that a contribution? Did you make those people aware of that? Did you notify the donor? So if anyone has events and someone's paying a ticket more than $75, you want to make sure you tell them what part of that is to cover what they're receiving in as a benefit to going to that event or supporting that event versus a contribution. Part 6 then talks all about the governing body. So a lot of times this information, other than the individuals, is not going to change from year to year. But if you do have any significant bylaw changes, you want to make sure that that is noted here, number of voting members, etc. Section B, this is a section that I definitely recommend that people take a look at. And this is all about policies. And the reason I say that is there are some, I'll call them watchdog websites out there that are rating nonprofits. So essentially telling you how the health or, how, I don't want to say how good of a nonprofit you are, but essentially it's taking your nonprofit and kind of grading you on what policies you have in place, how you're spending your money, etc. And a lot of these policies, like a whistleblower policy, conflict of interest policy, etc., go into those ratings. And this is an area that often does get missed a little bit. So it's a good thing to take a look at this and make sure that you are filling this out correctly. And are there any of these policies that you don't have in place that you easily could put in place that kind of gives you an additional one up on some of those watchdog websites that are rating nonprofits. It's also good just to have as many of these policies in place because you can kind of look at it and say, look, we're doing as much as we can as a nonprofit to be, legitimate and have transparency with those that are donating to us. The bottom of this page then is really about how you disclose your information and where you file. So number 17 here is actually going to have what states you're required to file in. So if it's just Pennsylvania, if it's just Maryland, or if it's multiple, those states will be listed here on your 990. And then this tells the reader of your 990 how to contact you to get information as far as reviewing your 990, if you have a 990T, or any other forms that are required to be available to the public. I will note one item. This just came up in a conversation with a small nonprofit I work with. There are multiple times in the 990 where you list a person's name and contact information, usually an address. I highly recommend that you use the business address for the individuals that you're putting in here. I started working with this client and they didn't realize that the individual that had been preparing their 990 was putting their personal address rather than the business address in there. And when I said to them, anyone can look up this 990 and your home address is there, that probably is something you don't want. So there is a box on here where you essentially say, like, if someone is not able to be contacted at the business address, you then need to provide that information. But I think in most cases, if someone needs to get a hold of an employee, management, or a board member, using the business address would be fine. Part 7 then is when we get into information about our board members and our key employees, our highest paid employees, etc. This is, again, interpretation can be a little bit different here, but always go back to the instructions on how they're defining key employees, highest compensated employees. Typically, we're going to see that a CEO or president, sometimes a CFO, maybe a COO, etc., are going to be included on this. What's key here is when we're including an individual on this schedule, it is really representing that these individuals have governance responsibility or key management responsibility for the organization. And if there's any compensation related to that individual, so your board members often do not have compensation, but any of your employees, their compensation is going to need to go on this form. So in addition to their name and title, how many hours they spend, you're going to list what their position is, essentially why they're on this schedule. Then you're going to report any compensation and additional benefits on the schedule. Again, that's public information. This is part of being a nonprofit. The one thing I will point out here, though, is the instructions here specifically point to the W-2. So this is where it can get a little wonky for you if you are not a calendar year-end nonprofit. If you are a calendar year-end nonprofit, the information that you're going to be putting in this schedule is going to be the same information that you're putting later in our revenues, expenses, etc. But if you are a fiscal year June 30, for example, nonprofit, this information here is going to want salaries and benefits by calendar year because it's going to link to the individual's W-2. Whereas back a little further, when we look at expenses, that's going to be based on the fiscal year. So that's where if we often are asking you for, hey, we need this person's salary and benefits for the calendar year and for the fiscal year, that's why. It's because the two schedules are different on the 990. And that's because the IRS is looking to link that information to the W-2 for those individuals. You do have 2 pages for that information. As usually board members will end up going on to the second page there. And then there is a section at the bottom, section B, for independent contractors. I would say this isn't used a lot by most of our nonprofits, but if you do pay an independent contractor more than $100,000 each year, you would need to include that on this schedule. Part 8 is all about our revenues. So now is where we're going to break up our revenues into contributed revenue, program service revenue, and then there's some other categories down here, other revenues. So I'm just going to highlight up here on the contributed revenue, line 1E, right here. This is going to be the line that you do not include when you're looking at how much your contributed revenue is for the state of Pennsylvania's filing. And that's because that is the government grants or contributions. So essentially, if we're looking to see what we have to file for Pennsylvania, we would look at the total of all those lines minus 1E. It is still contributed revenue, it's just not included in that calculation for the state of Pennsylvania. Program service revenue. So this is what's going to be directly related to your programs. And this is going to link to that page 2 where we had our program service accomplishments by program. That's what's going to link to that is those program revenue items. And then down here under other revenue, this is where we're going to break out some of our, if we have any rental income, if we have fundraising events, if there's a piece of that that is considered a contribution, it would be included up above, which is shown right here. So we'd say gross income from fundraising events, not including any contributions that essentially we have up here under contributions. So that's where we do break out that information. And there is a schedule or a spot at the bottom for miscellaneous revenue. So if you don't have a bucket that you find revenue should go in, you can put it there and label it. The next section follows in suit with our statement of functional expenses. So in column A is going to be total expenses. Column B is going to be program service expenses. So those are directly related to your mission. That again is going to tie to that page 2 where we talked about our program service accomplishments. So the total program service expenses on that page should tie to our total program service expenses here. We do have 2 more columns then. Since our functional expenses, we show them by program or direct expenses, fundraising expenses, and then indirect or administrative management and general expenses. So these are your 3 functional expense categories, and then your total column here on the left. And pretty much this often does somewhat tie to your financial statements. The categories might be different. We will see a lot of times there's inconsistencies between nonprofits and how they how one categorizes expenses for this statement versus another. But essentially, if there are items that you can't fit in up above, there are some line items here where you can put in a description as kind of other expenses. Last 2 pages then of our core schedules, the balance sheet. So this is pretty self-explanatory. This is going to be the same thing. We're going to show the beginning of the year like we did on the summary page and then the end of the year. So pretty common sense, but this should definitely tie to the end of the year for your previous 990 unless there was some kind of prior period adjustment or correction. That is one thing to note. If something does change after a 990 is filed, a corrected 990 can be filed. So if something does come up, that can happen. But our balance sheet is going to be split out very similar to our financial statements with assets, liabilities, and then our net assets at the bottom. The last page I want to point out then at the top here, part 11, is the reconciliation of net assets. So there are a couple of things that are handled differently on your financial statements versus your 990. Unrealized gains or losses on investments are one of those. Any bad debt write-offs are another. Prior period adjustments. Those are the types of things that essentially this is what we should do to reconcile what we have reported on the previous pages to our financial statements, whether they're compiled, reviewed, or audited financial statements. So at the very end, line 10 should equal essentially what our net assets equal on our financial statement. So often there can be some activity in here that gets a little confusing because you might look at your functional expenses on the 990 versus the statements and say, well, why doesn't it tie? And it's because bad debt write-offs or unrealized losses, etc. And those will show on this page. And then the last piece talks about your financial statements and reporting. So this is going to say what accounting method or basis of accounting that you use. And then are they consolidated financial statements? Did you have an audit? Did you have to have a single audit, etc.? And then from there, essentially, is all of the additional schedules that have to be added on based on how we completed pages 1 through 12. And each of those schedules, again, can be varying lengths of pages and have additional information needed depending on how you fill out that information. Just a reminder on deadlines real quick. So your 990 is due the 15th day of the 5th month after year end. So if you're a 12/31 year end, your 990 is due May 15th. But there is a 6-month extension that can easily be applied for. It just needs to be filed. If you don't file the extension, you essentially have a late 990. You do not want to pay late fees for 990s. So make sure that, again, that extension is fine. It's 6 months. It takes you from May 15th to 11/15. If you are June 30 year end, a 12/31 year end, And so, but just making sure that that extension is filed. There's no fee, there's nothing related to that. With the state of Pennsylvania, your filing is required the 15th day of the 11th month. So that's November 15th. So if you extend your 990, it ends up being due the same day as your state filing. So I know that was a lot of information. Any questions for me? I will also be around during break if anyone has any questions, because I know it is break time. I don't want to get in the way of your break, but any questions for me?